Professor Haughton, thank you so very much for joining our interview series. Let me start with the first question. What are the main characteristics of the radical right and far right movements in Slovakia, and how do they compare to similar movements in other European countries?
So I think it's worth emphasizing that there are a number of radical right parties and movements in Slovakia. It's worth emphasizing that we can think about, for example, the Slovak National Party, which has been a party on the political scene in Slovakia for the past 30 years. It actually traces its roots back to the 19th century. That's a party which is has been sort of fairly consistently kind of radical right in its agenda. But we've also seen in more recent times, in the past decade or so, also some parties that I would label more as kind of neo-fascist parties. Party around Marian Kotleva and the party that split from it, Republika. So those parties have a much sharper and stronger kind of nationalist message and a more kind of discriminatory message towards particular minorities. In terms of how they compare and contrast to other parties across Europe, I think that there are some notable similarities in the sense that many kind of radical right parties, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, often the kind of focus of their criticism tended to be other countries or other ethnic groups closer to home, as it were. So the Slovak National Party, for example, was very critical of ethnic Hungarians in the past, but that shifted much more towards a criticism more about a sort of common or criticism against sort of non-European elements, if you like. So focusing more on particularly linked to the migration crisis, so particularly linked to Muslim immigration into Slovakia, or the threat of that, as it were. So there's been that sort of notable shift, and they've got sort of they now have common cause really with a number of the other radical right parties in Europe.
All right. How has Robert Fico's leadership influenced the rise of populism and far-right politics in Slovakia? Additionally, how significant a role do you think populism played in the assassination attempt on the Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico?
So I should probably stress at the beginning that I'm not, and I appreciate I'm talking to the European Centre for Populism Studies. I'm not someone who's the biggest fan of the term populism as a label. I prefer to think of looking at kind of populist appeals rather than labeling particular politicians or particular parties as populist. But if we look at kind of broad kind of populist appeals in terms of thinking that thinking about the sort of pure nation and the kind of soiled elite, if you like, those sort of populist appeals have been used by Robert Fico, for example, over time. We can also say, which is important, is there have been kind of links between, or increasingly links between Robert Fico and some parties and some politicians that we would see as having used a lot of those kind of populist appeals. So certainly he's played a role in pushing those particular messages in Slovakia. In terms of the shooting of Fico and the role that those sorts of populist appeals played, I think it's worth emphasizing two things. Here, we can distinguish between the particular individual who was arrested. His motivations appear to be a criticism of the domestic politics of Robert Fico, particularly in terms of changes to the state broadcaster. This is one thing that he kind of emphasized in this video that started to do the rounds on social media. But I think also we need to put that motivation of that individual within the broader context of the fact that Slovak politics has become quite polarized in recent times. And certainly the camp around sort of Robert Fico, that side of the political divide, have tended to push a number of kind of narratives that we might want to put under a kind of populism label.
What is the role of immigration and national identity in the political rhetoric of Slovakia's far-right parties? How do they use these issues to gain support? And what strategies have populist and far-right parties in Slovakia used to gain and maintain political power? How effective have these strategies been?
Okay, so firstly, just want to emphasize that I wouldn't classify Robert Fico as a far-right party. So if I talk about the other parties that I would classify in that way, so certainly the theme of immigration has been very important for these radical right parties, both in terms of sort of actual immigration, but often more kind of perceived threat of or worry about the impact the immigration might have culturally on and politically on a country like Slovakia. But clearly that kind of the fear of the outsider, the fear of the other is something that the far-right parties and far-right politicians have played on. But it's important that for their appeal, it's as much about what they see as kind of domestic forces which are important in mobilizing support around them. So it's also about what they see as the impact of liberals and progressives and their sorts of agenda on Slovak politics that has provided an important rallying point and rallying call for the far right in Slovakia.
In your article, The Return of Robert Fico, you argued that the fate of democracy was at risk with the urbanization of Slovakia. Can you please elaborate on the future of Slovakian democracy after assassination attempt?
Okay, so yeah, I mean that particular article, we were that remark of mine was about, I was actually referring to some people who were talking about the potential kind of urbanization, if you like, and certainly what we saw in what we've seen in Slovakia since the election of Fico and the creation of his government is a movement aware or certain measures which certainly don't sit comfortably with our kind of understanding of liberal democracy. So we've seen, for example, changes to the criminal code. We are seeing changes being pushed through to for the state broadcaster, for example. We saw measures being pushed through which have impacted the funding for the NGO sector. So we have seen a kind of movement in that direction. Sorry, the second half of your question, I don't think I've answered. Could you repeat it?
Can you please elaborate on the future of Slovakian democracy after the assassination attempt?
Yeah, so I think what I would want to emphasize here is there is a kind of an immediate reaction and a longer term reaction. So in the immediate reaction, I think I was quite concerned, very concerned with developments, because the reaction of a number of key politicians close to Fico was to point the finger of blame at liberals and progressives. And that was seemingly kind of exacerbating the polarization of Slovak society. And there were attempts by people like incoming President Peter Pellegrini and current President Zuzana Čaputová to encourage all the leaders of political parties to come together. But those efforts were actually snubbed by a number of politicians. So that was kind of worrying and concerning. I would say that in the last few days, the picture seems to be a little calmer, a little bit better. But nonetheless, I would still suggest that Slovak politics is very much at a critical moment. And a lot of that is going to come down to Robert Fico himself. It's worth emphasizing he's been the dominant figure of Slovak politics for the past 20 years. He dominates his political party. At the moment, there are different voices within his political party about how they should respond to the events. a much more kind of pragmatic line around the current sort of de facto Prime Minister Robert Kaliňák, and a much more kind of pro-Russian line around a politician like Luboš Blaha. So at the moment, you know, it's a critical moment, and Slovakia can go in many different directions. And it's going to come down in significantly to the language and rhetoric that the politicians around Fico are likely to use. But as I said, the last couple of days, I've been a little bit more, I felt a little bit better about the state of Slovakia, because the rhetoric seems to have been toned down a little bit. But it's very difficult to judge these things so soon after the events.
Right. Former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright called Slovakia a black hole in the center of Europe back in 1997. What do you think of this characterization? Does Slovakia still deserve to be labeled as the black hole in the center of Europe?
So it's worth emphasizing that she came up with that label during the time that Vladimir Mečiar and his government was in power. And it's worth emphasizing that Slovakia wasn't invited to begin accession negotiations to join the European Union in 97, unlike Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, the other kind of E4 states. And it looked as if Slovakia was kind of going off on its own kind of different direction. So maybe at that time, I think it was a reasonably apt kind of label to use, but it was very much at that particular period of time. Since that particular time, I mean, it's worth emphasizing that Slovakia has now been a member state of the European Union for 20 years. It's actually more integrated into European structures than some of its other Visegrad 4 partners. It's part of the Eurozone, for example, which isn't true of some of the other states surrounding it. So I think Slovakia is very much part of the kind of European mainstream. Of course, there have been some question marks more recently since Fico took power, particularly in terms of Slovakia's stance on the war in Ukraine, moving back from Slovakia being a strong advocate and supporter militarily of Ukraine to Slovakia under Fico becoming one that is critical of military involvement. So I suppose you could say that Slovakia is currently kind of less close to the kind of ideological core within the EU, but I certainly wouldn't describe it as a black hole in Central Europe.
All right. What does the assassination attempt on Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico tell us about the political culture, the level of polarization, and populism in Slovakia?
So certainly it tells us, so again, I think I would distinguish between the actual event itself and the reaction to it, which I think is important. So in terms of the event itself, according to what we know about the particular individual who was arrested and charged for the assassination attempt, clearly he seems to have been motivated by a strong political disagreement with Fico, although it's worth saying kind of on social media all sorts of other kind of images about this individual have circulated. So it's a little difficult to say definitively. But more broadly, if you look at the kind of reaction to the events in Handlova, we can certainly see that it emphasizes a strong kind of polarization of politics. And it's interesting to see that the country really is quite divided. I was reading an article today which was looking at some polling on a range of political questions in Slovakia and responses to particular policies that the Fico government are introducing. And it's very clear that there are a number of people who are strongly in favor of the agenda of the Fico government, and there are a number who are opposed. And in terms of polarization, what's striking is that there's strong overlap between the groups that are in favor of particular measures. So we can see a very strong kind of division of Slovak society. So there is significant polarization for sure.
Slovak Interior Minister Matus Estok stated that the country was on the doorstep of a civil war right after the shooting, suggesting that the assassination attempt on the prime minister confirmed this. Do you believe Slovakia, a member of the European Union and NATO, is truly on the brink of a civil war, or do you think this is a far-fetched assessment?
Yeah, I wouldn't. I don't think that particular characterization is accurate. Slovakia is a country where there are tensions, and it is a country where there are strong differences of opinion. I think it's much too strong to suggest that the country is on the verge of civil war. That was a phrase that was uttered pretty much in the immediate aftermath of the shooting. So I think it was probably driven more by a kind of emotional reaction rather than a carefully thought out, considered judgment. But yes, I don't think that's an accurate depiction of Slovak society, but rather, as I emphasized, it is a divided society.
Mm-hmm. Senior officials in Mr. Fico's governing CEDAR party have accused liberal journalists and opposition politicians of motivating the shooter to open fire. Rudolf Huliak, that you just mentioned, an ally of the government from the far-right Slovak National Party, claimed progressive and journalists have Robert Fico's blood on their hands. Is there any truth in these accusations?
Well, I mean, obviously, that's a very emotive phrasing that they're using. I certainly wouldn't want to use that kind of phrasing. I think if we try and step back and look at it in a more kind of scholarly way, and we think about polarization in Slovak society, polarization has come from the rhetoric and language used on both sides of politics in Slovakia. Certainly, the liberal progressive media is very critical of the steps taken by Robert Fico. They would argue that they are in their right as journalists to call out what they see as wrong and to point out what they see are the harmful steps that are being taken by the Fico government. Certainly, though, those are critical voices, and those kind of critical voices and the noises from certain politicians that say, you know, we need to stop Robert Fico. That can be, I would want to be careful about this. That can be then kind of interpreted in a way to say that it provides some kind of justification for what happened. I don't think that's true, but it does create a kind of context in which the kind of stakes of politics seem to be much higher. So though that side of the political debate has played a role in the polarization of Slovak society and politics, for sure.
Mr. Fico is pushing a strongly contested overhaul of the judiciary to limit the scope of corruption investigations, reshape the national broadcasting system to purge what the government calls liberal bias, and crack down on foreign-funded non-governmental organizations. He opposes military aid to Ukraine, LGBTQ rights, and the power of the European Union, while favoring friendly relations with Vladimir Putin's Russia. Do you agree that all these points indicate that Mr. Fico is a far-right populist leader par excellence, or not?
So I would certainly not classify Robert Fico as a far-right populist politician. I mean, all of the things that you've mentioned, we can reflect on. I mean, I think I would want to say that I think it's difficult to know how to categorize Robert Fico and where he stands. I think I would sort of layer an explanation. So firstly, to say that at the core of Fico and his party Smer's appeal over a long period of time are more kind of leftist economic policies in terms of believing in the role of the state, in terms of directing a lot of socioeconomic policies towards supporting the poorer parts of society. If you look at a number of his socioeconomic measures over time, they've been directed at that. Now, some of those policies over time have been labeled as populist, and they certainly have populist characteristics, like giving free travel for pensioners and those sorts of measures, increasing pensions and the like. So there's a sort of strong kind of left-leaning socioeconomic core. Then I think we need to add into the story the fact that increasingly Robert Fico has used more kind of nationalist rhetoric over time, particularly since the migration crisis in 2015. And I think that, what gives you a good indication of the changes of Robert Fico over time is the change of the name of his party. So his party was originally called just Smer, so Smer meaning direction. Then briefly it was Smer Tretia Cesta, so Smer third way. So he was actually kind of aping the era of Tony Blair and Gerhard Schröder. It then in the mid 2000s became Smer Socialna Demokracja, so direction social democracy, so really kind of emphasizing sort of that part of the spectrum. But recently it's been described as, rebranded as Smer Slovenska Socialna Demokracja, as direction Slovak social democracy. And that in a way conveys two things. One, it conveys this idea of a sort of Slovak version of social democracy, but also by using the word Slovenska, it's also emphasizing the kind of nation. So it's this combination of more leftist economics with a stronger kind of national appeal, plus the leadership of Robert Fico. It's these three elements that really explain Fico, and that means sometimes it's difficult to classify and categorize Fico's party. And I understand when I give long answers like that it's not what everyone always wants to hear. But I think it is important to bear in mind it's difficult to classify. And certainly I would not say that Robert Fico is a far-right politician.
All right. How have pro-Russian media and the issue of Ukraine shaped Slovakian politics?
So in terms of Ukraine and the war in Ukraine, that became an important theme in domestic Slovak politics in the run-up to the 2023 elections. And obviously, as I think is well known, Robert Fico's criticism of the West's military involvement in the war was important in his re-election his election in 2023. I would emphasize that primarily the election in 2023 was about domestic factors, but the Ukraine war played some kind of a role. What's striking that since he took power, he has pushed through with his policies in terms of not sending another bullet to Ukraine, to stopping Slovakia's military contributions to the war in Ukraine. But at the same time, he's been very keen to emphasize that actually he's supportive of reconstruction and helping Ukraine kind of rebuild itself and helping the country in socioeconomic terms. So there was a meeting a month or so ago in Michalovce in the far east of Slovakia where ministers from both the Slovak and Ukrainian governments came together to agree deals on infrastructure, energy, and all of those sorts of areas. What is worth saying is that opponents of Robert Fico, particularly on the more kind of liberal progressive side, they've certainly criticized Fico's stance as sort of moving Slovakia away from the European mainstream, and they are much more in favor of Slovakia taking a more a stronger kind of pro-Ukrainian position. And actually, we saw the difference of those two viewpoints during the presidential election in Slovakia earlier this year. So Ukraine is an issue that does divide Slovak politics. But the division is about the military kind of involvement. In terms of Russia broadly and about Russian disinformation, for example, there are plenty of studies that suggest that disinformation from Russian sources is quite important and influential. There are a significant number of Slovaks that get their news through these kind of what are often described as alternative media sources, many of which are seen to be influenced significantly by Russia and Russian money. So we can certainly see that there seems to be an impact in terms of the media sphere. The extent to which that actually translates through into actual politics and people's views and attitudes, and of course, it's very, very difficult to say in a scholarly academic way. These are things where it's often very difficult to find evidence to prove these things. But there does seem to be a significant role that Russia has played in influencing debate and influencing discussion in particular kind of sections of the media. And also, I mean, I haven't mentioned social media, but also in certain social media, the use of certain social medias, we've seen Russian influence being quite significant there as well.
In 2018, Fico had to resign as prime minister in the face of enormous street protests following the murder of investigative journalist Jan Kuciak, who was investigating government corruption, and his fiancée Martina Kusnirova. What has been the significance of Kuciak's murder in Slovakian politics?
So it was a very significant event. What the consequence of that, it led directly to Robert Fico resigning as prime minister back in 2018. He stayed as his party leader, but he resigned as prime minister. It also played an important role in the defeat of Smer at the 2020 parliamentary elections. So it certainly played an important role at those two moments. I think broadly, it's an important event that is often invoked and used by the kind of anti-Fico forces as a way of mobilizing and rallying individuals. So what's important is in the immediate aftermath of that murder, we saw major kind of demonstrations on the streets of Slovakia. And this kind of campaign, All for Jan, became pretty significant in terms of the mobilization of that anti-Fico sentiment. And I think that event was also important in helping to kind of bring together some of the opposition forces who came together after the 2020 election to form a government. And it's still one of those events in Slovakia's history which is invoked as a way of trying to rally the anti-Fico forces. So it still has significant resonance today, even 6 years after the event.
And lastly, according to the New York Times, Slovakia has the highest proportion of citizens who view liberal democracy as a threat to their identity and values among all the countries in Central and Eastern Europe that shook off communist rule in 1989. Additionally, 27% of Slovaks see Russia as a key strategic partner, the highest level in the region. What does this tell us about the political culture of Slovakia compared to other Central and Eastern European countries?
So I think it highlights some important factors. I think it highlights the fact that there are a significant proportion of the population, a country like Slovakia, that feel that the system hasn't delivered or delivered well enough for them over the past few decades. So I think that that's important, and it also tells us that we need to be aware of the threats and dangers to democracy, and that democracy is fragile in many respects, not just in Slovakia but in many other countries. I would say across the region as a whole, but actually not even just sort of Central and Eastern Europe. I think more generally across Europe, there are concerns and worries about the state of democracy. So I would take the data from the Slovak case as a way of illustrating some underlying tensions and problems and challenges that many European countries face. And I think that sense of disappointment with with democracy is quite widespread. I don't want to push it too far. I don't want to emphasize it too much. I don't want to suggest that, you know, we're on the verge of all democracies collapsing in Europe, but I just wanted to emphasize that there are significant proportion of population who are unhappy with what democracies are kind of delivering. And I think that's, you know, and Slovakia kind of illustrates that very well. And in those kind of circumstances where significant slices of the electorate are unhappy with the current political system, then they can be open to the appeals of other kind of politicians who advocate change to the system, whether more minor or actually more extensive changes.
All right. Professor Haughton, thank you so very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All the best.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.